Hi! This time I wanted to talk about how to use traps and puzzles in solo role playing games. This is probably one of the more tricky, more difficult aspects of running a solo role playing game, specifically one in which you are playing as a player character or a party of adventurers with an emulated game master. That is different from when you are using, for example, Abraham's method. I'm going to put a link in the description below to my method to play as a game master with emulated player characters. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. In fact, I think I'm going to create a playlist because there are a couple of videos that also supplement the material in the Abraham's method video. So, when you are playing as a player character, you lose those moments, that element of surprise, of just being amazed at the result of a trap, of a puzzle, the effects, how to disarm that trap, how to figure out or solve that puzzle, and what happens if you fail. What's the damage that you're going to take, but how the mechanism works, perhaps what the puzzle is related to in a particular adventure. There are some difficulties when it comes to figuring out all of that because as a solo player you are generating everything, perhaps using a game master emulator, of course, so it's very difficult to surprise yourself. You depend on the you rely on the effect of the random results. Any result that you obtain as you are generating the content of your adventure, that is going to be producing the effect of feeling surprised or unraveling secrets related to a trap or a puzzle. So for some people it could seem pretty impossible. So I want to tell you about 4 ways in which I have handled those situations. I don't have a preference for a particular method or way to handle things when it comes to traps and puzzles in a solo role playing game adventure. I think it depends a lot on my mood, on the tools that I have at my disposal. I think that it's better if you combine perhaps 2 or 3 of the methods or pathways, so to speak, that I'm going to talk about. And so let's start with the first one, which is the simpler method, but perhaps a potentially boring method as well. So the first way in which you can handle traps and puzzles in a solo adventure is by making rolls and checks. As simple as that. When you are generating the content of an adventure site, be it a fantasy game or a sci-fi game, anything, and you encounter this trap or this puzzle, you rely completely on the skills of your player characters to solve that. So it's pretty simple and potentially boring, but there is a way to make it a bit more colorful. You can generate many details and characteristics of the trap or the puzzle by making rolls on your favorite book of tables or adventure site generators, etc. But the negative aspect of this is that it's so perhaps bland, perhaps too simple. You encounter a trap, you make your roll to see if you can avoid the trap or disarm it or anything, or you encounter a puzzle, you make perhaps like an intelligence check or perhaps a wisdom check if it's related to some other things, perhaps something related to figuring out the mysteries of a particular philosophy or lore. But if it's something perhaps quite mathematical or that makes sense with some other things that you have seen in the dungeon, then you make an intelligence check and you were successful at your check, then you figured out the puzzle. And that's it. So that could be a bit disappointing for some people, but if you're playing a quick adventure and you just want to measure your player character's abilities against the dungeon, it works perfectly fine. You can always add a bit more lore, a bit more flavor by making some rolls that give more details about the trap, what it's supposed to do to you, to your player characters, what the puzzle is all about. Does it have some sort of decoration, some sort of strange shape in the puzzle pieces, a particular door or a passageway decorated with something perhaps? So it's very handy for you to have different books of tables like the Ultimate Toolbox or the Tome of Adventure Design. I'm going to put links to those books in the description below. Now let's move on to the next method that is more involved in my opinion, and this is through using trap and puzzle books. So every time you encounter a trap, do not generate that trap. Do not determine all of the characteristics of that hazard. Take a book, for example. I forget the complete name. I think it's Grimtooth's Ultimate Trap Collection. I'm also going to put a link in the description below to that book. It's a massive tome filled with lots of traps. And what I basically do is that when I encounter a trap, beforehand I prepare a table of random traps. I just take a quick look at the pages of the book, and I just write down the pages. I make a table making perhaps a D20 or if you want a D100 roll. Like I said, there are many traps. However, not all of the traps in that book are useful for this particular method. So, like I said, maybe you are walking into this dungeon and you encounter a trap. It could also be a sci-fi game. As I told you, you just need to adjust the fantasy trappings for that particular setting. You make your roll on the table that you created using the different pages of the Grimtooth book, or maybe you just open the book, or you move up and down the PDF and you select a trap randomly quite quickly, and you have to read that trap just enough so that you obtain enough information, sufficient information for you to try to solve that trap. Of course, this approaches the old school style of things. You could also make a check or a roll with your thief or your specialist or it depends on the game, and maybe you can solve the trap that way, but there is the risk of failing and the trap activates in your face. Or maybe you decide to handle things completely old school. Only very specific traps allow for a disarm trap or find trap sort of check. It all depends on what you want. Maybe you can determine that through the using Mythic, a game master emulator, to see if a trap can be solved by making a roll or by, like I said, using the old school method. So back to the old school method. You encounter the trap, you make the roll on your table, and you start to read that page. So let's say that you start reading an entry in the Grimtooth book, and it reads something like, when you open the door, you see this ascending set of stone steps, and at the very top you see a statue of a man carrying a huge sphere or globe on his back. Then you have to stop reading, and now you have to figure out a way to try to, if you want to proceed through that room, how would you go into that room? How would you go up the set of steps? Are you going to climb that is the walls instead of trying to just walk on the steps? Or maybe you're going to use some sort of spell, or if you're just moving up the steps normally, maybe you want to raise your shield at the very least to see if that helps somehow. It could go in many different ways. It depends on your creativity. Or maybe you decide to send perhaps a halfling or one of the shorter members in your group, a gnome or a goblin, and that character is going to move as close to one of the corners of the room, trying to see if he can fits into this very specific area in case something happens. Perhaps the sphere or the globe is going to roll down the steps, and because the halfling or the goblin or gnome or whatever is just barely tucked in into this corner of the room, maybe the sphere passes that character by and nothing bad happens. So then when you make your decision, you stick to it for the sake of fairness, and you keep on reading, and then you see what happens with the trap, what activates the trap, and if your choice was intelligent enough to overcome this device. So that's one way of handling things. Now when it comes to puzzles, it's a bit trickier. In that case, you will need some book or some tables to also provide some solutions for the puzzles. maybe you have, like I said, you're using the Tome of Adventure design, or some you have tweaked some of the results of the Ultimate Toolbox, and you encounter this puzzle. Maybe you see this small looking box in front of you. It has like making some random rolls, you determine that it has several buttons perhaps, or a single lever, and you are thinking how to solve that puzzle. So maybe you make your choice. Maybe you say something like, well, I'm going to press the buttons in a particular numerical sequence, or I'm going to ignore the buttons completely, and I'm just going to open the box as if it wasn't closed. Or maybe I'm going to ignore the box, and the real solution to this puzzle is actually the pedestal, or the plinth, or the base upon which the box rests. Maybe that's the real container. And then you make your roll using the Tome of Adventure, or the Ultimate Toolbox, or the Game Master's Apprentice deck that I also use in Abraham's method. And the answer that you get, if it makes sense with your course of action, with the way you decided to solve that puzzle, then you solve the puzzle and you determine the reward randomly. Or it also depends, right? In the case of the box, it could be some sort of item contained within, and if you wanted to crush the box instead, you could rule out that it automatically destroys the object within. It is now useless, so that way it's a bit more challenging to solve the puzzle. So it's all about making sense of the results that you obtain. Now let's move on to the third way. This is the more unorthodox method, in my opinion. It's basically, I used it as a sort of, it was the result of me watching a video several years back. It was when I think Paizo was doing much better when it comes to establishing a healthy way of handling just their business. And right now you see so much push when it comes to politics. But like more than a decade, I think it was 14 or 16 years ago, more or less, there was this guy that worked at Paizo. I don't remember his name, and the video is not available on YouTube. It was a sort of panel carried out via Google Plus back when I think you can still, I haven't experimented it yet, but I think you can still use Google to video chat. But back then you had like a different service, and you saw this panel of this man talking about how you could integrate fitness and exercise into your role-playing games. He talked about many different things, like, for example, that when you took damage, then you need to do push-ups, or pull-ups, or sit-ups, or crunches, etc. It depends. And so he kind of like combined exercise with many different tasks in the game. And so I use that as inspiration, that some traps and some puzzles could require you to make some rolls or checks. Instead of making those rolls or checks, you do some sort of exercise to solve that puzzle or to deactivate that trap. So, for example, maybe you see this hallway or this passageway, and there are a lot of suspicious-looking tiles on the floor, on the ground. This was determined by a random result, of course. So maybe you could be thinking, I don't trust those tiles. Maybe they are electrified, or maybe they produce some sort of nefarious spell effect. So I want to climb the walls. So maybe you decide that it's a physical exercise that requires push-ups or burpees. So you make a roll using, it depends on your limit. You need to be aware of your own physical limit. So perhaps if you're somewhat physically fit, maybe you are able to do between 25 or 50. You make a D50 roll, you roll a D100, and you have the result rounded up. And depending on the number that you obtain, now you need to do that number of push-ups or of burpees, or however you decide to handle the test. So it all depends on the type of trap. Maybe there is some other thing that you need to get out of a pit. Maybe those would be pull-ups. You make a random roll to see how many pull-ups you need to do. it's always good to go a bit beyond your limit. So there could be some impossible situations to solve. So maybe you can only do, let's say, 15 or 20 pull-ups, no? So you make a number, relative 30 perhaps, and then you get 28. Let's see if you can do 28 pull-ups. Maybe a lot of people won't be able to do it, and they won't be able to escape that trap, and they will suffer some sort of damage or mishap or death if that's the way you are handling things. Maybe it's a very gritty game, but just as some general advice, be aware of your own physical methods. If you are not into fitness, um, you could end up hurting yourself if you try to go beyond your limit. If you make your roll and it goes beyond what you can normally accomplish in a particular physical exercise, be very careful. If you cannot do anymore, don't push it. No pun intended. Because otherwise you could end up injuring yourself, some muscle injury, or like a hernia. That's pretty risky. You have like a if you do exercise while you're bloated or something, there are some cases that they could suffer some hernias. So it's all about being careful, and it applies the same way in puzzles. Maybe a puzzle requires you to, depending on the results that you obtain, you see this wall that has many like reliefs or objects sticking out of the wall, and you see some very suspicious objects at the very top. So maybe you decide that you need to do some sort of climbing, like I said, or jumping check, or maybe you need to push something. Maybe you can do triangle push-ups to represent that you are pushing one of those objects that are sticking out of the wall into it to see if you can solve the puzzle. Now, some general advice before we move on to the last method. I recommend that in most cases those traps and puzzles are not well, in the case of puzzles, that they are not mandatory, that they do not present some sort of barrier for you to move on with the adventure, because otherwise there could be some puzzles that you cannot solve, and then now you are stuck. Unless you want to handle things like you need to go to town or the city and hire a specialist or someone who knows how to solve that puzzle, or perhaps some sort of lore master or scholar that has deciphered the different texts that tell you how to figure out how to solve that particular puzzle or trick or anything. Then you could handle it like that. If you do not solve that puzzle, you just need to pay some money. You lose a bit of gold or silver or whatever currency you are using, to hire that person so that you can solve that puzzle or trap. So it all depends on how you want to handle things. Maybe the figuring out that puzzle or overcoming that trap only gives you a reward in the form of magical items or treasure, gems, etc. So it all depends on how you want to handle things. Maybe you could have like a bit of balance. In some cases, you really need to figure out some puzzle to move forward. You could also have some cases in which you need to go through that room or corridor. Even if you trigger the trap, you have to hope that your character will be able to withstand the damage, or maybe make some really good saving throws to avoid the hazard completely. It all depends on what you want. Now let's move on to the last way of solving the puzzles and traps, and this is through storytelling. This sounds perhaps too freeform, but there is a method to this madness. For this, you're going to need a book of tables and perhaps the Game Master's Apprentice deck. I think that you could even use the deck by itself. This consists on when you find a puzzle or a trap and you do not know how to disarm it, you basically put that on hold and you keep on going with the adventure. So let's say that you're playing a science fantasy game and you enter this strange temple that combines technology with magic, and you encounter this sort of mural or painting on the wall, and the images look so realistic, and you see like a lion man shooting some sort of laser rifle at a lizard man that is wielding some weird sci-fi saber, and you have no idea if this puzzle represents something, if this image or mural or painting can be activated in some way, or if it points to some other mystery within the dungeon, within the, let's say, yes, like an ancient techno pyramid, let's say. You keep on going, you keep on going, you move on, you take another path, you go down another corridor, and eventually maybe you get a similar result. Maybe depending on the tables that you are using or the game master emulator, you get something like art, like a sculpture or another mural or painting. And if you get some rolls that are related to the lion man attacking the lizard man, then it makes sense that perhaps that new artsy element within the dungeon provides the answer on how to solve the other puzzle. Maybe you see a painting that it's almost the same, but in that painting the blade, the sci-fi blade of the lizard man is covered in blood, and the other one was completely clean. You had the silver blade displayed in all its elegance. So maybe you think that it needs to look a bit gory for some reason. So maybe you go back and you decide to apply some paint, or maybe you use your own blood or the blood of your enemies to paint that blade, and suddenly some sort of science fantasy mechanism activates and the mural opens up. So that's the way that you are determining how to solve puzzles within that dungeon. And it also applies to traps. Maybe you see this tunnel, this circular tunnel, and it has many lights, and you are afraid that there is some sort of dangerous trap within it. You take another path, you start making some rolls, and then some result indicates the solution to a previous problem, and you say, oh, maybe this is the solution for that trap. Maybe there is some sort of card or chip that you need to take with you, and when you enter that tunnel of lights, you display it, or you try to pass it over the walls to see if there is some sort of scanner, and voila, it deactivates a trap that was going to cook you using microwave energy. So it's all about making sense of things depending on the random results that you obtain. And like I said, you can use the Tome of Adventure Design, the Ultimate Toolbox, the Game Master's Apprentice deck. It's all about making sense of the fictional narrative or the story that you are building. Something that you can encounter in one room perhaps can only be solved when you go to a different area, different zone, or maybe when you defeat an enemy, you search through the enemy's stuff, his backpack or his briefcase or whatever, and the answer is revealed, that you can solve that particular trap or puzzle using some object that the enemy had or some information. It's all about making sense of things. And for example, in the case of the Tome of Adventure Design, I highly recommend that book because there are so many things related to traps, like mechanisms and triggers, and so it's very easy to come up with your own mixed table of the results there, or just selecting a table as it appears in the book immediately. You make your roll and you try to figure out the result of something. Back to traps. Maybe you are in your typical fantasy setting and you are walking around and you see this part, perhaps this hub-like area, and it is completely closed. There are these tunnels or doors, but they are shut completely with some iron slabs or something. And there is, in the middle of the room, there is a skull with horns and with some gemstones inserted into the skull's eyes. So now you need to decide first how you're going to solve this puzzle slash trap. You do not know what it is. So maybe you start thinking and you say, I'm going to take the right horn of the skull and I'm going to twist it downwards. So now you make your roll on your tool of preference, the Ultimate Toolbox, the Tome of Adventure Design, the Game Master's Apprentice books, deck, the Game Master's Apprentice deck. And depending on the result, maybe it says something like right, or horn, or pointy, or anything. Then that means that you solved the puzzle or the trap. but it says something completely unrelated, like um, secret passage, or eyes, in the case of the skull, eyes, or teeth, then you failed, you did something that was did not help in solving the puzzle or disarming the trap, and now you suffer the consequences, if there are consequences. Maybe things just stand still. It will all be determined by your roles using the Game Master Emulator, Game Master's Apprentice, etc. So as you can see, these are just some general ideas. They are highly customizable by you. You can pick and choose whatever you like of the methods. Maybe in some cases you want to do the exercise that I mentioned, or maybe in some cases you want to use the Tome of Adventure design. In other ways, you just want to solve things through simple roles. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have other ideas on how to handle traps and puzzles in solo role-playing games, please let us know in the comment section below or make a video response. So thank you for watching this video, and thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru-RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.